The first snowfall always changed the village overnight. Fields disappeared beneath a soft white blanket. Narrow paths grew quiet, and every cottage seemed to draw a little closer to its neighbors as winter settled. Across the countryside, long before the cold arrived, every family had spent months preparing for these days. Firewood was stacked beside each home. Potatoes, turnips, onions, and carrots filled cool cellars, and jars of fruit preserves waited patiently on wooden shelves. Nothing was left to chance because everyone knew that a careless autumn could become a hungry winter. At the center of every cottage burned the fireplace, the most valuable place in the house. It warmed frozen hands, cooked every meal, dried damp clothes, and filled the room with comforting light after the sun disappeared in the late afternoon. Families guarded the fire carefully because relighting it from cold ashes was slow and difficult. Most cottages were small, built from stone or timber with thick walls that held warmth surprisingly well. Tiny windows admitted only a little daylight, while heavy curtains and wooden shutters helped keep the icy wind outside once darkness arrived. The furniture was plain but sturdy. A strong wooden table stood near the hearth, surrounded by simple chairs, polished smooth through years of daily use. Shelves carried clay bowls, iron cooking pots, candles, and a handful of treasured possessions passed from one generation to the next. Nothing inside the house was unnecessary because every object served a purpose. As evening arrived, children gathered close to the fire while their parents prepared a simple supper of porridge or vegetable soup. The flames crackled softly as clothes dried nearby and kettles steamed above glowing coals. Outside, the snow continued to fall without a sound. But inside every cottage, there was gentle conversation, quiet work, and the reassuring feeling that careful preparation had earned another peaceful winter evening. For the villagers, survival did not depend upon comfort or luxury. It depended upon patience, discipline, and the steady warmth of a fire that never seemed to sleep. When winter tightened its grip, keeping the cottage warm became the most important task of every day. The fireplace burned from morning until night, fed carefully with seasoned oak ash, or beech that had been cut and dried many months before. Green wood was avoided, whenever possible, because it smoked heavily and gave little warmth. Every log was precious, so no one wasted fuel. Larger pieces burned through the night, while smaller branches quickly revived the flames each morning. Even the ashes had their purpose, sometimes used to help clean pots or scattered where they could be useful. Around the home, the thick stone chimney slowly absorbed the heat and released it long after the fire had settled into glowing embers. Families arranged their daily lives around this comforting warmth. Chairs were pulled close to the hearth. Children played on woven rugs, and grandparents shared stories that had been told for generations. Women knitted woolen stockings, patched worn coats, and spun yarn, while men repaired tools or carefully mended baskets that would be needed when spring finally returned. The doors remained tightly closed, and rolled cloth was placed along the bottom to stop cold drafts from creeping inside. Heavy curtains covered the windows before sunset, trapping as much warmth as possible. The ceilings were low, allowing the heat to gather where the family lived instead of disappearing above their heads. Everyone wore several layers of clothing, even indoors. Wool shirts, knitted shawls, sturdy socks, and simple caps helped hold body heat throughout the day. Cold hands were often stretched toward the flames while kettles gently steamed above the fire, adding warmth and moisture to the dry winter air. The smell of burning wood, mixed with fresh bread and warm tea, created an atmosphere that many later remembered as the true scent of winter. Outside, frost covered every tree branch and icy winds swept across empty fields. Yet inside, the cottage time seemed to move more slowly. The fire glowed softly, candlelight danced across the walls, and the quiet sounds of family life made even the longest winter evening feel safe. Although the season demanded constant work and careful planning, the warmth of the hearth reminded everyone that home was more than shelter. It was the place where hope lasted, until the first signs of spring appeared once again. As darkness covered the village and the fire settled into glowing embers, families slowly prepared for another long winter night. Bedrooms were rarely warm, and most cottages had only one fireplace, so the farther a room stood from the hearth, the colder it became. Before climbing into bed, many people stood beside the fire for a few extra moments, warming their hands and feet before carrying the last of the day's comfort with them. Beds were simple but thoughtfully made to hold as much warmth as possible. Thick mattresses were stuffed with straw, wool, or dried grasses, then covered with linen sheets that were washed and carefully mended year after year. Heavy wool blankets were layered one upon another, and families often shared beds, not only because cottages were small, but because sleeping close together helped everyone stay warm through the freezing night. Children commonly slept beside their brothers and sisters, while the youngest often rested near their parents. Before bedtime, a metal or stone warming pan filled with hot coals was sometimes passed between the sheets to remove the bitter chill. Once the bed felt warm enough, it was taken away before anyone climbed inside. In homes without such comforts, heated bricks or smooth stones, wrapped in cloth, were placed near the feet, beneath the blankets, slowly releasing their warmth until sleep arrived. Night clothes were made from soft linen, and many people wore knitted caps to keep their heads warm since much body heat escaped during the night. Thick curtains around the bed, when a family could afford them, helped trap precious warmth and shield sleepers from cold drafts that slipped through tiny cracks in doors and windows. Outside, frost painted delicate patterns across the glass, while icy winds rattled the shutters and whispered around the walls. Inside, the cottage grew quiet except for the gentle crackling of the dying fire and the occasional creak of old timber settling in the cold. Even while sleeping, families remained aware of the weather, hoping the fire would still hold enough glowing embers to make lighting the morning flames easier. Rest was never taken for granted during winter, yet there was comfort in familiar routines, in warm blankets carefully tucked beneath tired hands, and in the peaceful knowledge that another cold night had been met. Together beneath one humble roof, winter meals in a Victorian village were simple, filling, and carefully planned to last until spring. Fresh vegetables were rare once the gardens slept beneath snow, so families depended on everything they had stored during the harvest. Potatoes, carrots, turnips, and dried peas became the foundation of nearly every meal. Apples gathered in autumn were kept in cool lofts or cellars where they could last for many weeks, and jars of preserved berries or fruit added a welcome taste of summer during the coldest months. Every morning the fire was brought back to life, and before long an iron pot hung above the flames. Soup simmered slowly for hours, growing richer as more vegetables and sometimes a small piece of salted meat were added. Nothing was hurried, because slow cooking made the most of every ingredient and filled the cottage with comforting aromas that lingered all day. Bread was baked whenever flour allowed, its crust turning golden beside the hearth. Thick slices were often spread with butter when it was available, or dipped into steaming broth until they became soft and satisfying. Oatmeal porridge remained one of the most common breakfasts, warming both body and spirit before another cold day began. Cheese made during the warmer months was carefully rationed, while smoked bacon or salted pork appeared only in small portions, stretched across several meals to make precious supplies last. Waste was almost unknown. Leftover soup became tomorrow's dinner. Stale bread thickened stews, and vegetable scraps were saved whenever they could still be used. Even bones were boiled again to draw out every bit of flavor. Warm drinks were equally important during winter evenings. Tea had become more common in many homes, though it was still treated with care, while children often enjoyed warm milk or simple herbal Infusions gathered during the summer. As darkness settled outside and snow quietly covered the village roads, the family gathered around the wooden table close to the fire. The meal itself was humble, yet the warmth of the room, the smell of fresh bread, and the familiar voices of loved ones transformed ordinary food into something deeply comforting. Winter taught people to appreciate every loaf, every bowl of soup, and every shared supper, because each meal represented months of hard work, careful planning, and the quiet hope that the stores would carry them safely until spring returned once more. The hardest part of winter was not always the snow, but the endless cold that settled into every corner of village life. During long stretches of freezing weather, the ground became as hard as stone. Wells sometimes froze near the surface, and every task demanded more strength than it had only a few months before. A family constantly worried about one question above all others. Would the firewood last until spring? If autumn had been wet, some logs never dried properly and burned poorly, filling the cottage with smoke instead of warmth. People learned to use every scrap of fuel. Fallen branches, bundles of twigs, dried peat in some regions, and even carefully collected hedge trimmings were saved, because nothing that could burn was considered worthless. Many cottages were warmer than the open air, but they were rarely truly warm. Frost often formed on the inside of window panes during particularly cold nights. Water left in a bucket could develop a thin layer of ice by morning, especially in rooms without a fire. Damp clothing dried slowly, and boots placed too close to the flames could crack or shrink, so they had to be warmed with patience. Smoke from fireplaces sometimes lingered indoors when the wind blew down the chimney, making eyes sting and filling the air with the smell of soot. Clean air and warmth were difficult to balance. Winter also brought illness. Coughs, chest infections, influenza, and pneumonia claimed many lives before modern medicine existed. Older villagers and young children faced the greatest danger whenever cold weather lasted for weeks. Most families relied on herbal remedies, warm broths, and plenty of rest, but there was often little else they could do. Food had to be rationed carefully as the weeks passed. By late winter, the cellar shelves looked emptier. Vegetables became softer, and salted meat was used sparingly. Fresh milk was less plentiful because cows produced less during the cold months unless they were well fed. Eggs also became scarce, as hens laid fewer in the short days of winter. Yet despite these hardships, village life continued. Neighbors quietly shared kindling with families who had little fuel, helped repair damaged roofs after heavy snow, and checked on elderly people living alone. Winter reminded everyone that survival was rarely achieved by one household alone. It depended upon careful preparation, practical knowledge passed from one generation to the next, and the quiet generosity of a community that understood how easily fortune could change. Before the first warm days of spring finally arrived, for a Victorian village family, surviving winter depended not only on caring for one another, but also on keeping their animals alive. A single cow could provide precious milk, a few hens might still lay occasional eggs, and sheep offered valuable wool that could be spun into warm clothing. Losing even one animal during winter could mean hunger or hardship for the entire household once spring arrived. Long before the first snowfall, barns were filled with hay gathered throughout the summer. Every bundle represented hours of hard work beneath the hot sun, and by winter each armful was measured carefully. If the harvest had been poor or heavy rains had spoiled the hay, families worried constantly that there would not be enough feed to last until fresh grass returned. Cows, horses, and sheep burned more energy simply to stay warm, meaning they needed extra food during the coldest weeks. Water created another daily challenge. Buckets left outdoors often froze solid overnight, so villagers broke the ice every morning or carried fresh water from wells several times a day. In severe weather, they sometimes carried warm water from the house to encourage animals to drink. A thirsty animal quickly became weak, and weakness often led to illness. Barns provided shelter, but were far from comfortable. Most were built from timber with gaps that allowed fresh air to circulate because completely sealed. Buildings trapped moisture, leading to dangerous dampness and disease. Thick layers of straw covered the floors, helping animals stay dry while also producing a little natural warmth as fresh bedding slowly decomposed. Beneath them, every morning the old straw had to be removed and replaced, even when the weather was bitterly cold. Children often helped with these chores before breakfast, their boots crunching across frozen ground long before sunrise. Chickens were especially affected by the short winter days, laying far fewer eggs because they received less natural light. Milk production also dropped as cows spent more energy keeping themselves warm. Families understood these seasonal changes and planned their food stores accordingly. During snowstorms, reaching the barn itself could become difficult as drifts blocked doors and buried pathways. Yet no matter how fierce the weather became, the animals still needed feeding before the family sat down to eat. Their care came first, because everyone understood a simple truth passed through generations. If the livestock survived the winter, there was hope that the family would thrive again when green fields finally returned. Beneath the warming spring sun, a winter day in a Victorian village began long before sunrise. During the coldest months, the mornings remained dark until well after 7 o'clock. Yet most families were already awake. The first task belonged to whoever rose earliest. Someone carefully uncovered the glowing embers buried beneath last night's ashes and added dry kindling, hoping the fire had survived until morning. If the embers had gone cold, starting a new fire with flint and tinder could take precious time while everyone waited in the freezing cottage. Before breakfast, the animals had to be fed. Cows were milked, horses received hay, sheep were checked for signs of illness, and chickens were given grain if supplies allowed. Water buckets often contained ice that had to be broken apart with a wooden mallet before the animals could drink. Only after these chores did the family return indoors for a simple breakfast, usually warm porridge, bread, or leftovers from the previous evening's soup. Winter offered fewer hours of daylight, so every hour became valuable. Men repaired fences damaged by storms, chopped more firewood whenever possible, sharpened farm tools, and maintained wagons for the busy seasons ahead. Women baked bread, prepared meals, washed clothing in icy water that had first been heated over the fire, spun wool into thread, knitted garments, mended blankets, and cared for young children. Even children were expected to help. They carried wood, gathered eggs, cleaned boots, fetched water, watched younger brothers and sisters, and assisted with countless small jobs that kept the household running. By afternoon, the sun already hung low in the sky, and darkness returned surprisingly quickly. Candlelight was expensive because candles required tallow or beeswax, so families used them sparingly. Most evening activities took place near the fireplace where the flames provided both light and warmth. Reading was a luxury for those who owned books, while storytelling, singing, sewing, and quiet conversation filled the remaining hours. There was little idleness, because almost every moment could be spent repairing clothing, preparing food, or making something needed for the months ahead. As the fire burned lower and the wind whistled outside, the family prepared once again for sleep, knowing the same routine would begin before dawn. Winter slowed the fields, but never truly stopped the work. Life continued every single day, shaped by discipline, shared responsibility, and the understanding that even the smallest daily task helped carry the household safely through another cold season. Keeping clean during a Victorian winter was far more difficult than many people imagine today. Water did not flow from taps, and heating enough for washing required hours of work. Every bucket had to be carried from the well or nearby stream, and during severe frosts, the surface often froze solid. Villagers broke the ice with heavy tools before, lowering their buckets into the freezing water below. Once inside the cottage, the water was poured into large iron pots and slowly heated over the fire. Because firewood was valuable, families could not afford to heat large amounts of water every day. Full baths were uncommon during the coldest months, especially among working families. Instead, people usually washed their faces, hands, necks, and feet with warm water from a basin, using linen cloths that were cleaned and dried beside the fire. Cleanliness remained important, but it had to be balanced against the time, fuel, and effort required to achieve it. Laundry was one of the hardest winter chores. Clothes were scrubbed by hand in wooden tubs using homemade soap made from animal fat and wood ash. The work was exhausting because wet wool and linen became extremely heavy. After washing, garments were wrung out by hand and hung close to the fireplace or in the warmest part of the cottage. Drying could take several days, and if clothes remained damp for too long, they developed an unpleasant smell or even mold. Boots demanded special care as well. Leather soaked by snow had to be dried slowly because placing them too close to the fire often caused the leather to crack and become stiff. Families rubbed boots with animal fat or natural oils to help keep moisture out and extend their useful life. Bedding also required attention. Whenever the weather allowed, blankets and straw mattresses were carried outdoors for a few hours to air out in the crisp winter sunlight. Fresh straw was added regularly because old bedding collected moisture and attracted insects. Even in cold weather, cottage doors or windows were sometimes opened briefly to replace smoky indoor air with fresh air. Despite the loss of warmth, the process was uncomfortable but necessary because fireplaces filled many homes with soot and smoke. Although these daily routines demanded patience and effort, they helped prevent illness and preserved the few possessions a family owned. In winter, every clean shirt, every dry blanket, and every carefully mended coat represented not comfort alone, but the determination to remain healthy until spring returned once again. A warm coat could mean the difference between comfort, suffering during a Victorian winter, yet very few village families could simply buy new clothing whenever they wished. Most garments were made at home or altered repeatedly until the fabric could no longer be repaired. Every piece of cloth represented months of work, beginning with the sheep that provided the wool. After shearing in spring, the fleece was washed, dried, combed, spun into yarn by hand, and finally woven or knitted into useful clothing. By the time winter arrived, every scarf, stocking, mitten, and blanket carried the memory of countless hours spent working beside the fire. Wool was treasured because it remained warm even when slightly damp, something linen and cotton could not do. Men often wore thick wool trousers, heavy jackets, sturdy caps, and long knitted socks tucked inside leather boots. Women layered linen undergarments beneath wool skirts, shawls, aprons, and cloaks, creating pockets of trapped air that helped preserve body heat. Instead of wearing one thick garment, several lighter layers kept people warmer and allowed them to remove clothing while working indoors near the fire. Children rarely received brand new clothes. Younger brothers and sisters usually inherited garments that had already belonged to older siblings. Sleeves were shortened, hems adjusted, patches carefully sewn over worn knees and elbows, and missing buttons replaced with whatever could be found. It was common for a single coat to remain in the same family for many years. Nothing useful was thrown away. Even clothing that had become too worn to mend found new purpose as cleaning cloths, quilt stuffing, or patches for blankets. Footwear required equal attention. Leather boots were expensive and often represented one of the family's greatest possessions. Holes were repaired quickly because wet feet could lead to illness during freezing weather. Many people stuffed extra wool, straw, or scraps of cloth inside their boots for additional insulation. When walking through snow or frozen mud, gloves were not always available, so hands often became rough and cracked from cold air and hard work. Animal fat or homemade ointments were rubbed into dry skin to reduce painful splitting. Every evening, damp clothing was hung near the fireplace to dry before the next morning's chores. The familiar sight of wool socks, coats, and shawls drying beside glowing embers became one of the quiet symbols of winter life. In a village where comfort depended more upon skill than wealth, warm clothing was not merely something to wear. It was the result of patience, thrift, and generations of knowledge carefully passed from parent to child. The fiercest winter storms could transform a quiet, Victorian village into an island surrounded by snow. After a night of heavy wind, people sometimes opened their doors only to find snowdrifts reaching halfway up the entrance or blocking it completely. The first task of the morning was often to dig a narrow path from the house to the barn because the animals could not wait for better weather. Men worked with wooden shovels while children carried away lighter piles of snow, and everyone understood that these paths might need to be cleared several times in a single day if the wind continued to blow. Travel almost stopped during severe storms. Dirt roads disappeared beneath deep snow, bridges became dangerously slippery, and wagons could no longer move through the drifts. A journey that normally took 1 hour could require an entire day or become impossible altogether. This isolation was one reason families worked so hard to prepare food, fuel, and animal feed before winter arrived. Once the roads were blocked, there was often no way to purchase supplies or ask for help from the nearest market town. The greatest concern during these storms was not inconvenience, but survival. If a chimney became blocked by snow, smoke could fill the cottage instead of escaping outside. Families regularly checked that the chimney remained clear, because a smoky room made breathing difficult and increased the danger of fire. Roofs also demanded attention. Wet snow could become surprisingly heavy, and although village cottages were built to withstand harsh winters, damaged thatch or loose slates sometimes needed emergency repairs as soon as the weather improved. Despite the dangers, winter storms also revealed the strength of village communities. As soon as the wind eased, neighbors visited one another to ensure everyone was safe. Young men helped elderly residents clear paths, shared spare firewood with households whose supplies had run low, and checked barns where animals might have become trapped by drifting snow. Bread, soup, and fresh water were quietly carried to those unable to leave their homes. No one expected payment because everyone understood that another storm might bring hardship to their own doorstep next time. Inside the cottages, life slowed even further. Families stayed close to the fire, repaired clothing, told stories, and listened to the wind roaring outside the thick walls. Every crackle of the hearth reminded them that warmth, food, and companionship were precious gifts during the darkest weeks of winter. When the storm finally passed and the first clear sunrise illuminated the snow-covered fields, the village emerged once again with gratitude, knowing they had endured another trial together. Not every family reached spring without loss, however carefully people prepared. Winter remained the most dangerous season of the year. A sudden illness, an empty woodpile, or the death of a single cow could quickly turn an ordinary household into one struggling simply to survive. Elderly people often suffered the most because their bodies produced less heat, and many spent entire days sitting as close to the fireplace as possible, wrapped in every blanket the family owned. Even then, some never fully escaped the cold. Infants were equally vulnerable. Mothers kept babies tightly wrapped in wool and carried them close to their own bodies whenever possible because a freezing cottage could become dangerous within only a few hours if the fire went out. Frostbite was a real risk for anyone forced to remain outdoors too long. Fingers, toes, ears, and noses were especially vulnerable during bitter winds. Farm workers sometimes returned home unable to feel their hands after hours spent feeding animals or clearing snow. If frozen skin was warmed too quickly beside a roaring fire, the pain could be severe and the damage even worse. Experience taught villagers to warm numb hands gradually, though they understood little about the medical reasons behind it. The cold, also claimed, lives in quieter ways. Pneumonia often began as nothing more than a cough after working for hours in wet clothing. Without antibiotics, a simple chest infection could become fatal within days. Many villages had no doctor nearby, and even where one was available, reaching the patient during heavy snow could be impossible. Families relied on herbal teas, warm blankets, and constant care. But love alone could not cure every illness. Food shortages became most serious near the end of winter. By February or March, many cellars held only a fraction of what they contained in autumn. Potatoes began to sprout, apples softened, and barrels of salted meat grew lighter every week. Some families quietly reduced their own portions so young children could eat a little more. Others stretched soups with oats or barley, making each meal last another day. Yet even during these difficult times, the village rarely abandoned those in greatest need. If a widow had no firewood, neighbors often left a bundle by her door before sunrise. If illness struck one household, others milked their cows or fed their animals until recovery came or mourning began. Winter revealed both the fragility and the resilience of village life. It reminded everyone that survival depended upon preparation and hard work, but also upon compassion. In the end, the greatest protection against the cold was not only the fire burning in the hearth, but the kindness that continued to burn within the community itself. Winter was not filled only with hardship. Even during the coldest months, people found small moments of joy that made the long season easier to endure. After the day's work was finished and the animals had been fed, the family gathered around the fireplace, where the warm glow of the flames created the brightest place in the cottage. Without radios or electric lights, the evening belonged to conversation. Grandparents told stories they had learned as children, many of them old village legends, tales of travelers caught in snowstorms, or humorous accounts of clever farmers and mischievous animals. Children listened closely, often hearing the same stories dozens of times without growing tired of them. Singing was another common way to pass the evening. Many families knew traditional folk songs by heart, and during Christmas, the cottages echoed with familiar carols that had been passed from one generation to the next. Music was simple, but if someone owned a fiddle, flute, or concertina, neighbors sometimes gathered for an evening of songs and quiet dancing once the weather allowed safe travel between houses. Winter also became the season for handicrafts. Women knitted scarves, socks, mittens, and blankets, while men carved wooden spoons, repaired furniture, or made toys for children using scraps of wood left from larger projects. These were not hobbies in the modern sense. Almost everything created during those evenings would be used by the family or traded with neighbors when spring arrived. Christmas brought one of the brightest moments of the year. Although gifts were usually modest, perhaps a hand-carved toy, a warm pair of knitted gloves, a small cake, or a ribbon, they were deeply appreciated because they represented time and care rather than money. Families prepared special meals using ingredients they had carefully saved for the occasion. A little extra meat, dried fruit pudding, fresh bread, or spiced cakes turned an ordinary supper into a celebration. Church services also played an important role throughout winter, bringing neighbors together despite the cold. People often walked several miles through snow to attend Sunday worship, wrapped in heavy cloaks and carrying lanterns through the darkness. These gatherings reminded everyone that they were not facing winter alone. Laughter, music, shared meals, and familiar traditions could not shorten the season, but they made it easier to bear. In a world where comfort was often scarce, the greatest luxury was spending an evening surrounded by family, listening to the crackling fire while snow drifted silently beyond the cottage windows and believing that brighter days would eventually return. By the time late February and early March arrived, many villagers believed the hardest part of winter had only just begun. The excitement of the first snowfall had long disappeared, replaced by weeks of cold, damp weather and growing uncertainty. Food stores that had seemed plentiful in autumn now looked alarmingly small. Barrels of salted meat were nearly empty. Sacks of oats felt lighter each week, and the last onions, carrots, and turnips had begun to soften despite the cool cellar. Potatoes that had survived the winter often started to sprout, and every usable one was carefully trimmed rather than thrown away because wasting. Food was simply not an option. Firewood also became a constant concern. The neatly stacked piles, prepared before winter had shrunk to only a few remaining rows. Families who had carefully rationed their fuel usually managed, but anyone who had misjudged the length of the season faced difficult choices. Some burned old fence posts, broken furniture beyond repair, or fallen branches gathered from nearby hedgerows whenever the weather briefly improved. Every log placed into the fireplace was a reminder that spring still had not arrived. The animals felt the strain as well. Hay supplies dwindled, and livestock grew thinner after months without fresh pasture. Farmers watched their cows and sheep closely, because illness spread more easily among weakened animals. Horses worked through mud, snow, and freezing rain, often pulling heavy loads despite receiving less feed than during summer. Everyone hoped they would remain healthy long enough to reach the first green shoots of grass. Yet small signs of change slowly appeared. The days became noticeably longer, allowing more work to be finished before darkness. Snow no longer remained untouched for weeks, and patches of muddy earth emerged beside stone walls and beneath trees. Birds that had been absent during the deepest cold began returning one by one, their songs sounding almost unfamiliar after months of silence. These simple changes lifted spirits throughout the village more than any feast ever could. Even so, experienced villagers knew better than to trust the weather too soon. A warm afternoon could easily be followed by another week of frost or a final heavy snowfall. Seeds remained safely stored indoors until the danger had truly passed. Winter often delivered one last reminder of its strength before finally releasing its grip. Still, as families sat beside the fire during those final evenings, they no longer spoke only about surviving the cold. They spoke about planting gardens, repairing fences, welcoming newborn lambs, and watching the fields turn green again. After months of endurance, hope itself became the greatest warmth in the cottage. At last, the village began to change. The snow no longer covered every field, and the frozen ground slowly softened beneath longer days and warmer sunshine. Water dripped steadily from cottage roofs. Streams flowed freely again, and the heavy silence of winter gave way to birdsong that had been absent for many months. The first signs of spring did not arrive all at once, but each small change reminded the villagers that another difficult season was finally coming to an end. The fireplace still burned every evening, yet it no longer needed to roar from dawn until bedtime. Families opened doors and windows for longer periods, allowing fresh air to replace the smoky smell that had filled their cottages throughout the winter. Blankets were carried outdoors to dry in the sunlight. Walls were scrubbed clean of soot, and every room seemed brighter after months of darkness. Attention quickly turned toward the fields. Men inspected fences damaged by snow and wind, repaired gates, sharpened plows, and prepared horses for another season of hard work. Women sorted the remaining seed potatoes, checked sacks of grain saved for planting, and carefully counted every seed, because a successful harvest would determine whether the next winter could also be survived. Children eagerly searched for the first flowers growing beside stone, walls or beneath leafless trees, treating each tiny blossom as proof that the cold had finally surrendered. The animals also sensed the changing season. Cows spent more time outdoors whenever the weather allowed. Sheep began grazing on the first patches of green grass, and hens gradually laid more eggs as daylight increased. Newborn lambs appeared in the fields, bringing life back to the quiet countryside and giving families renewed hope after the hardships of winter. Looking back, the villagers rarely spoke about the season in dramatic words. Hardship had become such a familiar part of life that surviving another winter felt less like a victory and more like another responsibility, successfully fulfilled. Yet everyone understood what had truly happened. They had endured months of freezing nights, careful rationing, endless chores, illness storms, and uncertainty. They had protected their families, preserved their animals, and kept the fire burning when the world outside seemed frozen and lifeless. As evening settled over the village once again, the cottages remained warm, but now the doors stood open to the gentle air of spring. The long winter had tested every household, yet it had also reminded them that patience, preparation, hard work, and the support of neighbors were often the strongest shelter any family could ever possess. As another spring settled over the countryside, life slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. The fields filled with workers once more, gardens were planted, sheep wandered across fresh green hills, and smoke no longer poured constantly from every chimney. The long winter became another memory shared by every family in the village. Some remembered the fiercest snowstorm. Others recalled evenings spent beside the glowing hearth, while many quietly reflected on the neighbors whose kindness had carried them through the hardest weeks. Winter had never been simply another season. It was a test of preparation, patience, endurance, and hope. Every loaf of bread, every armful of firewood, every warm blanket, and every healthy animal represented months of careful work completed long before the first snowflake ever touched the ground. The people of the Victorian countryside understood something that is easily forgotten today. Comfort was never guaranteed. Warmth had to be created. Food had to be preserved. Clothes had to be repaired. Homes had to be maintained. Every day required effort, and every season demanded respect. Yet, despite the hardships, village life was also filled with remarkable resilience. Families laughed together around modest tables. Children found joy in the simplest games. Neighbors shared what little they had, and the quiet glow of a fireplace transformed an ordinary cottage into a place of safety and peace. They measured wealth differently from the modern world. A full woodpile, healthy livestock, good neighbors, and a loving family were treasures beyond price. Perhaps that is why these winter evenings continue to capture our imagination today. There is something timeless about the sound of crackling logs, the flicker of candlelight against old stone walls, and stories shared while snow falls gently beyond the windows. They remind us that even in the coldest seasons, people have always found warmth in one another. Although the Victorian world has long since passed into history, its quiet lessons remain surprisingly familiar. Gratitude grows stronger after hardship. Hope shines brightest during darkness. And home is not defined by its size or its riches, but by the people gathered around its fire. Thank you for spending these winter evenings beside the hearth and traveling back through time too. Discover how ordinary village families endured one of the most demanding seasons of the year. If you enjoyed this cozy journey into the Victorian era, be sure to subscribe for more relaxing fireside stories, forgotten traditions, and peaceful evenings exploring everyday life from the past. Until next time, may your home stay warm, your fire burn bright, and your evenings always be filled with good stories.